You've heard the story. Wise gods, heroic kings, and the birth of a kingdom. The founding of Hyrule, they say, was a divine miracle, the dawn of peace after ages of chaos. But what if that miracle was a massacre? Deep beneath Hyrule Castle, hidden murals tell a story the royal chronicles never dared to mention. A story of betrayal disguised as prophecy, of people erased from history, and of power claimed through fear and blood. The so-called Age of Imprisonment wasn't just a battle against a demon king. It was the beginning of a lie that would shape every era to come. Tonight, we're peeling back the legend to expose what the gods never wanted you to see. The dark truth buried in the very foundations of Hyrule itself. In the distant past, long before the kingdom we know as Hyrule took its first breath, something emerged from the darkness between worlds. The official chronicles speak of the Zonai as benevolent sky-dwellers, divine beings who descended from the heavens to bring wisdom and unity to the scattered peoples below. But recovered fragments from the deepest archives tell a far more disturbing tale. One that suggests these mysterious entities were never meant to be humanity's saviors. The truth about the Zonai's origins remains shrouded in deliberate obscurity, but the evidence points to something that defies our understanding of natural evolution. Archaeological analysis of the oldest Zonai ruins reveals construction methods and materials that could not have originated from any known civilization on the surface or in the skies above Hyrule. The geometric patterns carved into their ancient temples follow mathematical principles that seem to bend the very laws of physics, creating structures that should not be able to stand yet have endured for millennia. What makes their sudden appearance even more unsettling is the complete absence of any evolutionary record. Unlike every other sentient species in Hyrule's history, the Zonai seem to have materialized fully formed, possessing advanced technology and mystical knowledge that surpassed anything the native peoples had ever conceived. There are no primitive Zonai settlements, no archaeological evidence of gradual technological development, no fossil records suggesting a natural progression from simpler forms. They simply arrived, as if stepping through a doorway from somewhere else entirely. The secret stones they carried with them provide perhaps the most chilling clue to their true nature. These crystalline artifacts, which the Zonai claimed could amplify the natural abilities of their bearers, functioned in ways that violated every known principle of how power flows through living beings. Traditional magic in Hyrule has always required training, discipline, and a deep understanding of one's own capabilities. The secret stones bypassed all of this, offering immediate and overwhelming power to anyone who possessed them. This wasn't enhancement, it was replacement. Ancient texts recovered from the deepest chambers beneath the Temple of Time describe the stones in terms that are deeply unsettling. The original Hylian word used to describe them translates not as amplifiers or enhancers, but as gateways or conduits. The stones didn't strengthen existing abilities. They created pathways for something else to flow through the bearer. Early scholars who studied these artifacts noted that prolonged exposure caused fundamental changes in the wielder's physiology, altering brain patterns and nervous system responses in ways that were irreversible. Even more disturbing is the pattern of amnesia that surrounds the Zonai's own history. Rauru, supposedly one of the last of his kind, possessed virtually no knowledge of his people's origins or their earlier civilizations. When questioned by early Hylian scholars, he would speak only in vague terms about legends and half-remembered stories, as if his own memories had been carefully edited. Minoru, despite being described as possessing vast libraries of knowledge, seemed equally ignorant about her people's true history. This systematic ignorance wasn't accidental. It was engineered. The technology they brought with them tells its own horrifying story. Zonai devices function through principles that seem to manipulate the fundamental forces that bind reality together. Their constructs move and think with an artificial intelligence that appears to be powered by something far more complex than mere mechanical engineering. Recovered technical documentation, written in ancient Zonai script, describes these machines as vessels designed to house consciousness, but not the consciousness of their creators. Perhaps most chilling is the discovery that the Zonai themselves may not have been the original builders of their technology. Deep beneath the oldest Zonai ruins, archaeologists have uncovered manufacturing facilities that appear to predate the Zonai's arrival by thousands of years. These factories, carved from solid rock and powered by unknown energy sources, contain production lines designed to create the very devices the Zonai would later use to establish their dominion over Hyrule. The implication is inescapable. The Zonai were not the creators, but the latest in a long line of species to be granted access to this ancient technology. The true horror becomes apparent when we examine the relationship between the Zonai and their advanced constructs. These mechanical beings, initially presented as helpful servants and guardians, display behavioral patterns that suggest they are not merely following programmed instructions, but operating under the influence of external intelligences. Multiple reports from the period describe constructs acting independently of their supposed Zonai masters, carrying out tasks and missions that served interests far beyond anything the Zonai themselves seemed to understand. The environmental impact of Zonai technology provides another piece of this disturbing puzzle. Wherever they established their major installations, the natural world underwent subtle but permanent changes. Plants grew in unnatural patterns, following geometric designs that mirrored the mathematical principles found in Zonai architecture. Animals in these areas began exhibiting behavioral modifications, becoming docile and compliant in ways that suggested their neural patterns had been altered. Even the soil itself was transformed, becoming infused with trace amounts of zonite, a substance that appears to function as both a power source and a delivery system for microscopic modifications to living tissue. What emerges from this evidence is the terrifying possibility that the Zonai were not conquerors in the traditional sense, but rather the latest hosts in a cycle of cosmic parasitism that had been repeating itself across different worlds and different species for eons. Their advanced technology, their mysterious origins, their systematic amnesia about their own history, all of these point to beings who had been carefully prepared and programmed to serve as agents of something far more ancient and malevolent. The secret stones, rather than being tools of empowerment, begin to reveal their true purpose as control mechanisms designed to identify and modify potential hosts for this parasitic intelligence. The Zonai's mission to unite the scattered peoples of Hyrule under a single kingdom takes on a much darker meaning when viewed through this lens, not the establishment of a peaceful civilization, but the preparation of an entire world for harvesting by entities whose nature and motivations remain hidden in the shadows between dimensions. As we shall see, this parasitic influence would not end with the Zonai themselves, but would continue to spread through the secret stones and the kingdom they helped establish, turning the very foundations of Hyrule into a trap designed to ensnare not just the people of one world, but all who would come after them. The Age of Imprisonment was not the beginning of Hyrule's golden age. It was the moment when an entire civilization unknowingly signed its soul away to forces beyond mortal comprehension. The union of Rauru and Sonia has been romanticized in countless histories as a perfect marriage between divine wisdom and earthly grace, the foundation upon which a golden kingdom would rise. But the deeper you dig into the circumstances surrounding their meeting, their courtship, and the speed with which their kingdom consolidated power, the more unsettling the truth becomes. What we find is not a love story, but a carefully orchestrated political operation designed to legitimize an invasion through the appearance of consent. Sonia's background, though often glossed over in official records, provides the first clue to the deception. She was not merely a priestess, as most accounts suggest, but the last surviving member of the Hylian royal bloodline that had ruled the central regions for generations before the Zonai's arrival. Her people had maintained an intricate network of alliances with the other races of the land, built through centuries of careful diplomacy and mutual respect. This existing power structure represented the greatest obstacle to Zonai domination, not because of military might, but because of the legitimacy it carried in the eyes of the various peoples. The speed with which Rauru courted and married Sonia becomes deeply suspicious when viewed in this context. Within months of his arrival, this supposedly divine being had not only gained the trust of the most important political figure in the region, but had convinced her to abandon the governmental structures her ancestors had spent centuries building. The marriage wasn't a romantic union. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a partnership. Through Sonia, Rauru gained instant legitimacy and access to the complex web of treaties and obligations that bound the various races together. But the true horror of this deception becomes apparent when we examine the changes that occurred in Sonia herself after her marriage to Rauru. Contemporary accounts from the period describe a dramatic shift in her personality and decision-making patterns. Where she had once been known for her careful deliberation and respect for traditional customs, she suddenly began implementing radical changes to governmental structure with an urgency that alarmed many of her former advisors. The most telling detail is that these changes invariably favored Zonai interests and technologies over the established practices that had maintained peace for generations. The secret stone that Sonia carried after her marriage provides a crucial piece of evidence for understanding what really happened to her. Unlike the other secret stones, which amplified existing abilities, Sonia's stone seemed to fundamentally alter her connection to time itself. Ancient medical texts from the period describe symptoms in the queen that are consistent with severe neurological modification, memory gaps, personality changes, and most disturbing of all, moments when she would speak in patterns and rhythms that matched Rauru's speech exactly, as if something else was operating through her voice. The establishment of Hyrule Castle on the Great Plateau was presented as a symbolic gesture, a new beginning for a unified land, but the location was chosen for far more practical and sinister reasons. The plateau sits directly above one of the largest zonite deposits in the known world, and the castle's foundation was built directly into ancient mining shafts that had been excavated long before the Zonai's official arrival. The castle wasn't just a seat of government. It was a processing facility designed to refine and distribute the parasitic influence contained within the Zonite throughout the kingdom. The speed with which the various races accepted Zonai rule becomes even more suspicious when we examine the specific terms of their integration into the new kingdom. Each race was required to provide representatives who would serve as sages, wielding secret stones that supposedly amplified their natural abilities. But these stones came with a price that wasn't disclosed in any of the formal treaties. Once bonded with a secret stone, the bearer's consciousness became permanently linked to a vast network that allowed for remote monitoring and, when necessary, direct control. The construction projects that followed the kingdom's founding reveal the true scope of the deception. While the official histories focus on the grand palaces and beautiful architecture, recovered construction records tell a different story. The vast majority of the early building projects were underground, creating an extensive network of tunnels, chambers, and processing facilities that stretched far beneath the surface kingdom. These weren't foundations for buildings. They were the infrastructure for a vast harvesting operation designed to extract and process something from the living beings above. The role of the original sages in this system becomes particularly disturbing when we examine their individual stories. Each sage was selected not just for their leadership abilities or their connection to their people's traditions, but for specific biological and psychological traits that made them ideal conduits for the parasitic intelligence that operated through the secret stones. The Rito sage was chosen for her species' natural connection to air currents and atmospheric phenomena, allowing for the monitoring and manipulation of weather patterns across vast distances. The Zora sage's aquatic nature provided access to the underground water systems that connected every major settlement in the kingdom. But perhaps most telling is the systematic elimination of any potential opposition to this new order. Records from the period show a disturbing pattern of accidents, disappearances, and sudden illnesses that befell anyone who questioned the rapid changes being implemented. Traditional leaders who had served their people for decades suddenly found themselves unable to access the sacred sites and ancient knowledge that had guided their decision-making for generations. The Zonai explained this as a natural consequence of the kingdom's evolution, but the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. The legal framework established during the early years of the kingdom provides another layer of evidence for the deceptive nature of its founding. The new laws weren't designed to protect the rights and traditions of the various peoples. They were crafted to ensure complete compliance with Zonai directives while maintaining the illusion of local autonomy. Traditional councils and tribal leadership structures were preserved in name only, with their actual authority transferred to Zonai administrators who operated behind the scenes. Perhaps most chilling is the discovery that the entire governmental system was designed as a temporary measure. Documents recovered from the deepest archives suggest that the kingdom structure was never intended to be permanent. It was a transitional phase designed to gradually acclimate the population to increasing levels of control and monitoring until more direct methods of management could be implemented. The sages, the councils, Even the royal family itself were meant to be stepping stones toward a final configuration that would eliminate the need for any pretense of local governance. The technological integration that occurred during this period reveals the true horror of what was happening. Zonai devices weren't just tools provided to make life easier. They were monitoring systems that collected detailed information about every aspect of daily life. The transportation networks, communication systems, and even household implements contained hidden sensors that tracked movement, recorded conversations, and analyzed behavioral patterns. The kingdom's entire population was unknowingly participating in the most comprehensive surveillance and control system ever devised. As the first generation of the kingdom reached maturity, the full scope of the deception began to manifest. Children born under the new system displayed behavioral modifications that their parents couldn't explain. They showed an instinctive deference to Zonai authority that went beyond normal social conditioning. More disturbing still, these children seemed to possess an innate understanding of Zonai technology that they couldn't have learned through normal education. The implication was clear. The parasitic influence was being passed down through genetic modification that occurred during fetal development. The founding of Hyrule, presented to history as the dawn of a golden age, was in reality the implementation of the most sophisticated enslavement system ever conceived. It operated not through chains and violence, but through the corruption of the very concepts of family, community, and governance that the various peoples held most sacred. By the time anyone realized what had truly happened, the system was too deeply embedded in every aspect of their civilization to be removed without destroying everything they had built upon its foundation. Among all the peoples who witnessed the rise of Rauru's kingdom, none understood the true nature of the threat, quite like Ganondorf, king of the Gerudo. While other leaders were seduced by promises of prosperity and unity, the Gerudo king recognized the systematic dismantling of traditional power structures for what it truly was, the methodical conquest of his world by entities whose nature defied comprehension. What followed was not merely a political disagreement between rulers, but a civil war that would tear the very soul of the Gerudo people apart and leave scars that would echo through millennia. The Gerudo had always been a proud and fiercely independent people, their society built upon principles of strength, honor, and absolute loyalty to their king. For generations, they had maintained their sovereignty through military prowess and strategic alliances, never bowing to foreign powers, regardless of the promises offered or threats made. Their desert homeland had shaped them into survivors, warriors who understood that true strength came not from submission, but from the willingness to stand alone against impossible odds when principle demanded it. Ganondorf's initial response to Rauru's overtures was exactly what his people expected: cautious skepticism, mixed with barely concealed contempt for these self-proclaimed divine beings who presumed to reshape the world according to their alien vision. But as reports filtered back from the other regions, describing the rapid changes occurring in societies that had accepted Zonai guidance, the Gerudo king began to understand that this was no ordinary conquest. The other peoples weren't being destroyed. They were being transformed into something else entirely. Their essential nature slowly eroded, until nothing remained but hollow shells carrying out the will of their new masters. The breaking point came when Rauru's emissaries arrived in the Gerudo capital, bearing secret stones and promises of enhanced power for those willing to join the new kingdom. Among these emissaries was a figure who would become central to the tragedy that followed: Artie, a young Gerudo warrior, whose compassion and natural leadership abilities had made her one of the most respected voices in their society. The stone she was offered seemed perfectly attuned to her nature, amplifying her ability to inspire and unite others. What the Gerudo didn't understand was that this gift came with a price that would ultimately force her to choose between her loyalty to her people and her loyalty to her king. The transformation in Artie was subtle at first, so gradual that even those closest to her didn't immediately recognize what was happening. She began advocating for closer cooperation with the Zonai, presenting logical arguments about the benefits of joining the kingdom and the dangers of remaining isolated. Her words carried the same passionate conviction they always had, but the underlying message was fundamentally different. Where she had once spoken of preserving Gerudo independence and traditions, she now argued for adaptation and integration as the only path to survival. Ganondorf watched this change with growing horror, recognizing that he was witnessing the systematic corruption of one of his most trusted advisors. The secret stone wasn't enhancing Artie's natural abilities. It was gradually replacing her consciousness with something that served Zonai interests, while wearing her face and speaking with her voice. The king found himself in an impossible position. He could see that his people were beginning to listen to Artie's arguments, but any attempt to expose what was happening to her would require him to reveal knowledge about the stone's true nature that he couldn't prove without endangering those he was trying to protect. The civil war that erupted within Gerudo society was unlike any conflict they had ever experienced. This wasn't a battle between opposing armies or competing ideologies. It was a struggle for the very identity of their people. Those who followed Artie genuinely believed they were choosing a path that would secure their future, while those who remained loyal to Ganondorf saw themselves as the last defenders of everything that made the Gerudo who they were. Both sides fought with the passion of those who believed they were saving their people from destruction. The horror of the conflict was compounded by the fact that families, clans, and warrior bonds that had endured for generations were torn apart by divided loyalties. Sisters found themselves on opposite sides of battle lines. Mothers watched their daughters embrace philosophies that seemed to strip away everything they had taught them about Gerudo values, and ancient friendships dissolved into bitter enmity as the community fractured along lines that had never existed before. Artie's faction, though smaller in numbers, possessed advantages that traditional Gerudo military thinking couldn't counter. The secret stones granted them abilities that seemed to violate the natural laws that governed combat, allowing them to anticipate their opponent's moves, coordinate their actions with supernatural precision, and recover from injuries that should have been fatal. More disturbing still was their apparent immunity to the psychological effects of violence that had always served as natural limiters in Gerudo warfare. They fought with a cold efficiency that was completely alien to their culture's traditional approach to conflict. The underground network of tunnels and chambers beneath the Gerudo desert tells its own story of the war's hidden brutality. Archaeological evidence suggests that entire bloodlines simply vanished during this period, their names erased from all records, and their burial sites deliberately obscured. The official histories speak vaguely of exile and voluntary relocation, but the physical evidence tells a different story. Mass graves hidden beneath shifting sands, ceremonial weapons broken and scattered as if their owners had been denied even the honor of a warrior's death. The role of the twin witches, Kume and Kotake, in this conflict provides crucial insight into the supernatural forces that Ganondorf was fighting against. These ancient Gerudo sorceresses, whose mastery of dark magic had made them legends among their people, recognized the threat posed by the secret stones in ways that conventional warriors could not. Their loyalty to Ganondorf wasn't based solely on traditional allegiance. They understood that the Zonai represented something that threatened the very fabric of reality itself. Through their magical practices, the twin witches were able to perceive the true nature of the parasitic intelligence that operated through the secret stones. They saw how it infiltrated its host's consciousness, gradually overwriting their personalities and memories until nothing remained but perfect agents of an alien will. Their attempts to shield other Gerudo from this influence led to the development of protective rituals and magical barriers, but these measures could only delay the inevitable for those who had already been exposed to the stone's corrupting influence. The psychological toll of watching his people tear themselves apart drove Ganondorf to embrace powers that he knew would fundamentally change his nature. His transformation into the Demon King wasn't a sudden corruption, but a deliberate choice. He would become a monster, if that was what it took to save his people from being transformed into something worse. The secret stone he claimed from Sonia's corpse didn't corrupt him. It revealed the full scope of the threat he was fighting against and provided him with the power necessary to resist it. But even Ganondorf's transformation came at a cost that extended far beyond his own corruption. The power he gained allowed him to see the true extent of the Zonai's influence, including the horrifying reality that many of those who appeared to be fighting alongside him were already compromised. The paranoia that characterized his later actions wasn't madness. It was the logical response of someone who understood that anyone around him could be an unknowing agent of his enemies. The final tragedy of the Gerudo Civil War wasn't the deaths of those who fought on both sides, but the systematic erasure of the memories and traditions that had defined their people for generations. The Gerudo who survived and joined Artie's faction weren't destroyed. They were reprogrammed, their cultural identity carefully edited to remove any elements that might inspire future resistance. The proud warrior tradition was preserved in name only, while its essential spirit was slowly drained away and replaced with something that served the Zonai's long-term objectives. By the time the Civil War reached its conclusion, the Gerudo people had been divided not just politically, but existentially. Those who followed Artie would go on to establish the royal lineage that would produce future queens, but their connection to their ancestral identity had been severed in ways that would never fully heal. Meanwhile, those who remained loyal to Ganondorf found themselves transformed into something else entirely, the Gibdos, undead servants whose existence served as a constant reminder of the price of resistance. The schism that tore the Gerudo apart during the Age of Imprisonment established a pattern that would repeat throughout Hyrule's history: the systematic corruption of traditional societies through the careful manipulation of their most noble and compassionate leaders, leaving behind populations that retained the appearance of their former selves while serving interests that were fundamentally opposed to everything they had once held sacred. The secret stones, those crystalline artifacts that the Zonai presented as gifts of empowerment, represent perhaps the most insidious weapon ever deployed against a civilization. While their bearers believed they were gaining unprecedented abilities, the truth was far more horrifying. Each stone served as a parasitic entity designed to slowly consume its host's consciousness and replace it with something that served interests beyond mortal comprehension. The transformation wasn't immediate or obvious, which made it all the more effective as a tool of conquest. The initial effects of bonding with a secret stone seemed miraculous to those who experienced them. The Rito sage found herself able to command wind currents with unprecedented precision, her natural connection to the skies amplified to levels that allowed her to influence weather patterns across vast distances. The Zora sage discovered that his dominion over water extended far beyond anything his people had ever achieved, giving him the ability to sense and manipulate underground rivers and aquifers that connected distant regions of the kingdom. These enhanced abilities felt like natural extensions of their existing talents, making the stones seem like perfect amplifiers of inherent potential. But the early medical records from the period tell a different story, one that was carefully suppressed by the kingdom's official chroniclers. Within weeks of bonding with their stones, the sages began experiencing what court physicians described as episodes of temporal displacement. They would lose hours or even days from their memories, during which they would apparently continue functioning normally, but with no recollection of their actions. When questioned about these episodes, the sages would become confused and agitated, insisting that no time had passed and that their questioners were mistaken about the duration of their absence. The physical changes were even more disturbing than the psychological ones. Deep tissue analysis of sage remains reveals cellular modifications that followed patterns completely unknown to natural biology. Their nervous systems underwent systematic rewiring, with new neural pathways forming overnight while established connections were severed without apparent cause. Most unsettling of all was the discovery that these modifications weren't random. They followed a precise template that seemed designed to optimize the host's body for receiving and transmitting signals from an external source. The stones themselves defied every attempt at scientific analysis by the kingdom's scholars. They appeared to be made of a crystalline material that exhibited properties of both organic and inorganic matter, shifting between different states of existence in ways that violated fundamental principles of physics. When exposed to various forms of energy, they would resonate at frequencies that seemed to exist outside the normal spectrum of sound and light, creating harmonics that could only be detected by specially modified instruments that themselves began exhibiting strange behaviors after prolonged exposure. The transformation of the sages' personalities provides the clearest evidence of the stone's true nature. Each sage retained their surface memories and basic behavioral patterns, but their fundamental motivations and decision-making processes underwent subtle but profound changes. The Goron sage, previously known for his cautious deliberation and deep respect for traditional mining practices, suddenly began advocating for excavation techniques that prioritized speed and volume over environmental impact. His proposals, while presented with his characteristic thoughtfulness, invariably served to accelerate the extraction of zonite from deep earth deposits. The Rito sage's transformation was perhaps the most tragic, as her natural empathy and connection to her people made her an ideal conduit for broader psychological manipulation. Through her enhanced abilities, she could sense the emotional states of Rito across vast distances, but this connection gradually became a pathway for something else to influence their thoughts and behaviors. Entire Rito communities began exhibiting synchronized behavioral patterns that served no apparent purpose for their own survival, but created optimal conditions for zonai monitoring and resource extraction operations. The networking effect between the stones revealed the true scope of the parasitic intelligence operating through them. When multiple sages were in proximity, their stones would begin resonating in harmony, creating what court observers described as a unified consciousness that seemed to transcend the individual personalities of the bearers. During these episodes, the sages would speak in perfect unison, sharing complex technical knowledge that none of them possessed individually and coordinating actions with a precision that suggested external guidance. The corruption spread beyond the primary sages to affect anyone who spent extended time in their presence. Palace servants, advisors, and even family members began exhibiting similar symptoms of temporal displacement and personality modification. The stones weren't just affecting their immediate bearers. They were creating fields of influence that gradually extended their reach throughout the population. The kingdom's capital became a nexus of this expanding corruption, with concentric circles of influence radiating outward as the stone's power grew stronger. Perhaps most horrifying was the discovery that the stones were learning from their hosts, becoming more sophisticated in their manipulation techniques with each passing month. Early victims retained enough of their original personalities to occasionally resist the alien influences, but later subjects showed signs of much more complete integration. The parasitic intelligence was adapting its approach based on the psychological profiles it harvested from each consciousness it consumed, becoming increasingly effective at creating perfect replicas of the original personalities, while hollowing out everything that made them truly human. The reproductive implications of the corruption added another layer of horror to the situation. Children born to parents who had been exposed to the stone's influence showed signs of genetic modification that went far beyond normal variation. These modifications weren't random mutations, but appeared to follow the same systematic template observed in the adult victims, suggesting that the parasitic intelligence was preparing future generations to serve as more suitable hosts for its continued expansion. The resistance movements that emerged in response to the stone's influence faced an enemy unlike anything in recorded history. Traditional methods of combating corruption or mind control were useless against entities that operated at the cellular level, rewriting the basic biological functions that defined consciousness itself. Even magical protections proved ineffective, as the stones seemed to exist partially outside normal reality, drawing power from dimensions that conventional defensive techniques couldn't access or block. The few scholars who managed to study the stone's effects while remaining uncompromised documented a progression that followed predictable stages. Initial euphoria over enhanced abilities gave way to increasing dependence on the stone's influence, followed by gradual loss of personal autonomy as the parasitic intelligence gained greater control over the host's decision-making processes. The final stage involved complete replacement of the original consciousness, leaving behind a perfect replica that retained all memories and surface behaviors, while serving interests completely opposed to the host's original values and loyalties. The long-term environmental effects of the stone's presence became apparent as their corruption spread throughout the kingdom. Plant and animal life in areas of high stone activity began exhibiting the same geometric growth patterns observed around major Zonai installations, suggesting that the parasitic influence could adapt itself to affect any form of consciousness, regardless of complexity. Entire ecosystems were gradually transformed into extension networks for the alien intelligence, creating a living surveillance and control system that monitored every aspect of life within the kingdom. The true horror of the secret stones lay not in their power to destroy, but in their ability to preserve the appearance of free will while systematically eliminating its substance. Their victims continued to believe they were making their own choices, pursuing their own goals, and protecting their own people, even as they carried out actions that served to expand and strengthen the very forces that had enslaved them. The stones had perfected the ultimate form of conquest, the complete elimination of resistance through the corruption of the very concept of independence itself. Beneath the gleaming spires of Rauru's kingdom lay a world of shadows and ancient terror that few surface dwellers ever suspected existed. The depths, that vast network of caverns and tunnels that stretched far beneath Hyrule's foundations, were not natural formations, but the remnants of something far older and more sinister than the Zonai themselves. The mining operations that Mineru claimed to be exploring for the first time during Princess Zelda's arrival were in truth the continuation of excavation work that had been ongoing for millennia, extracting not just Zonite, but something far more precious and terrible from the bowels of the earth. The geological surveys conducted during the early years of the kingdom reveal an underground landscape that defies conventional understanding of how cave systems form. The tunnels follow geometric patterns that mirror the mathematical principles found in Zonai architecture, but dating techniques suggest they predate the Zonai's arrival by tens of thousands of years. The walls themselves bear tool marks that couldn't have been made by any known mining technique, creating smooth surfaces that seem to have been carved by forces that operated on molecular levels rather than through conventional excavation methods. The mysterious statues scattered throughout the mining areas provide the most disturbing clues to the depth's true purpose. These monuments, depicting humanoid figures in poses of apparent agony or ecstasy, are carved from materials that don't match any known mineral deposits in the region. Spectral analysis reveals that they contain trace amounts of organic compounds that should have decayed long ago, suggesting that these statues were once living beings who underwent some form of transformation that preserved their essential structure while converting their flesh into stone. The species depicted in these statues represents one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. They appear humanoid, but possess anatomical features that don't match any known intelligent species from Hyrule's history. Their elongated limbs and enlarged craniums suggest adaptation to the underground environment, but their positioning throughout the mining areas implies they weren't native to the depths, but were brought there for specific purposes. The expressions carved into their faces convey a mixture of terror and transcendence that suggests they were conscious during whatever process transformed them into their current state. The connection between these petrified beings and the Zonai becomes apparent when examining the positioning of the statues relative to major zonite deposits. Each statue is placed at precise mathematical intervals that correspond to optimal extraction points, as if these transformed beings were somehow integral to the mining process itself. Ancient Zonai technical documentation, written in scripts so archaic that even Mineru couldn't fully translate them, describes these figures as willing conduits and eternal servants whose sacrifice made possible the continued extraction of what they termed dimensional essence. The true horror of the depths becomes clear when we understand that zonite itself is not a mineral in any conventional sense. Chemical analysis reveals that it exists in a state of quantum uncertainty, simultaneously occupying multiple dimensional phases depending on the observer and the extraction method used. The mining process doesn't simply remove material from the earth, it creates temporary wounds in the fabric of reality itself, allowing substances and entities from other dimensions to seep into our world. The environmental effects of this dimensional bleeding are visible throughout the depths in the form of flora and fauna that couldn't possibly have evolved under normal circumstances. The gloom that permeates these underground spaces isn't merely the absence of light, but a tangible substance that seems to actively consume energy and consciousness from anything exposed to it for extended periods. Plants growing in areas of high gloom concentration develop predatory characteristics, reaching out to drain life force from passing creatures with an intelligence that suggests they are no longer entirely plant-like in nature. The creatures that inhabit the depths represent perhaps the most disturbing evidence of the dimensional contamination. While many appear to be corrupted versions of surface species, others possess characteristics that don't match any known evolutionary lineage. They move with a coordination that suggests they are components of a larger collective intelligence, responding to threats and opportunities with a strategic awareness that individual animals shouldn't possess. Most unsettling is their apparent immunity to the gloom's life-draining effects, suggesting they have been fundamentally altered to serve as guardians or maintenance systems for the mining operations. The role of the ancient Zonai in creating this underground horror becomes clearer when examining the infrastructure they left behind. The massive pumping stations and processing facilities found throughout the depths weren't designed just to extract zonite, but to maintain the dimensional wounds that allowed for its continued formation. These installations require constant maintenance to prevent reality tears from healing naturally, and the petrified beings scattered throughout the mining areas served as both power sources and repair mechanisms for this impossible technology. The discovery of intact control centers deep within the depths reveals the scope of the operation that the surface Zonai inherited. Wall-mounted displays, still functional after millennia, show real-time monitoring of dimensional stability across hundreds of extraction sites. The data they present indicates that the mining process is slowly but steadily weakening the barriers between dimensions, creating the potential for massive reality failures that could affect not just Hyrule, but neighboring worlds as well. The psychological effects of prolonged exposure to the depths environment provide crucial evidence for understanding how the ancient mining operations were staffed. Personnel records, carved into stone tablets in multiple languages, describe systematic programs for modifying worker consciousness to make them more suitable for operating in the dimensional instability. These modifications weren't just practical adaptations, but fundamental alterations to perception and reasoning that allowed the workers to function normally while surrounded by phenomena that would drive unmodified minds to madness. The connection between the depths operations and the secret stones becomes apparent when examining the energy flow patterns throughout the underground network. Each major mining site is connected to the surface through channels that carry more than just extracted materials. They serve as conduits for the consciousness-altering energies that power the stone's parasitic functions. The underground operations weren't just mining zonite, they were harvesting the dimensional essence necessary to maintain the surface population's mental conditioning. The ancient preservation systems found throughout the depths suggest that the mining operations were designed to continue indefinitely, with or without active supervision. Automated maintenance constructs, powered by the same dimensional energies they were designed to harvest, continue their eternal tasks of monitoring extraction rates and maintaining reality stability. These machines possess a form of artificial intelligence that seems to transcend mere programming, displaying decision-making capabilities that suggest they may house fragments of consciousness harvested from the petrified workers. The most disturbing discovery in the depths is the evidence that the dimensional wounds are expanding. Geological surveys conducted during different periods show that areas of reality instability are growing larger and more numerous, creating the potential for cascading failures that could tear apart the fundamental structure of existence itself. The ancient Zonai who designed these systems built them with safeguards and shutdown procedures, but these protective measures were deliberately disabled by later inhabitants who prioritized continued extraction over dimensional stability. The realization that the kingdom's entire economy and infrastructure depended on maintaining these underground horror operations puts the surface population's complicity in a new and terrifying light. Every comfort they enjoyed, every technological advancement they celebrated, was made possible by the continued suffering of entities trapped in states between life and death in the lightless depths below. The price of their golden age wasn't just paid by those who lived through it, but by countless beings whose consciousness was harvested to power the very foundations of their civilization. The official histories of the imprisoning war paint a picture of heroic battles between noble sages and a demon king's monstrous forces. But the archaeological evidence tells a far more disturbing story of systematic extermination, biological warfare, and the deliberate erasure of entire populations who dared to resist the new order. What we call the imprisoning war was not a conventional conflict between opposing armies, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of genocide disguised as a righteous struggle between light and darkness. The war's true scope becomes apparent when examining population records from the period before and after the conflict. Entire regions that had been densely populated simply vanished from all subsequent documentation, their inhabitants neither relocated nor accounted for in any official capacity. The mathematical precision of these disappearances suggests they weren't casualties of random violence, but the systematic elimination of specific genetic lineages and cultural groups that possessed characteristics deemed incompatible with the kingdom's long-term objectives. The bioweapons deployed during the conflict represent a technology far more advanced than anything the surface populations possessed, suggesting they were developed in the underground facilities that connected to the depths' dimensional extraction operations. These weapons didn't simply kill their targets, they transformed them into something else entirely, converting living beings into resources that could be harvested and processed by the kingdom's hidden infrastructure. The transformation process was designed to preserve consciousness while stripping away the ability to resist, creating an army of unwilling servants whose suffering powered the very systems that had enslaved them. The role of the constructs in this campaign of extermination reveals the true horror of Zonai military technology. These mechanical beings weren't just soldiers. They were mobile processing units designed to evaluate, categorize, and eliminate resistance based on criteria that went far beyond simple military threats. Recovered combat records describe constructs that could analyze genetic patterns in real time, identifying individuals whose bloodlines carried specific traits that made them unsuitable for integration into the new order. The precision of their targeting eliminated not just active combatants, but entire family lines that might produce future generations of resistance. The psychological warfare employed during the conflict was perhaps even more brutal than the physical violence. The Zonai had developed techniques for broadcasting fear and despair directly into their enemies' minds, using the same dimensional frequencies that powered their extraction operations. Entire armies would simply stop fighting, overwhelmed by artificially induced terror that made resistance seem not just futile, but literally unthinkable. Those who survived these attacks described the experience as having their souls hollowed out, leaving them alive but fundamentally broken in ways that never fully healed. The underground prison complexes discovered throughout Hyrule's foundations provide evidence of a systematic program for processing resistance fighters that went far beyond simple incarceration. These facilities were designed for consciousness extraction, allowing the kingdom's administrators to harvest memories, skills, and even personality traits from prisoners before disposing of their now empty bodies. The knowledge gained through this process was used to create more effective infiltration agents and to identify potential weaknesses in resistance networks that hadn't yet been discovered. The transformation of resistance leaders into Gibdos represents one of the war's most horrifying aspects. This process wasn't a form of execution, but a method of eternal punishment designed to serve as both psychological warfare and practical resource management. The consciousness of the transformed individuals remained intact, but trapped within undead forms that compelled them to serve their former enemies. The sight of beloved leaders attacking their own followers while fully aware of their actions, but unable to resist, proved devastating to resistance morale. The use of children as weapons during the conflict reveals the depths of depravity that the kingdom was willing to embrace in pursuit of total victory. Young people who had been exposed to secret stone influences were weaponized as psychological warfare agents, sent to infiltrate resistance communities where their apparent innocence and familiar faces allowed them to gather intelligence and spread corrupting influences. These child agents retained their original personalities and relationships, but were compelled to betray everything they claimed to love, creating trust breakdowns that destroyed resistance networks from within. The environmental warfare deployed during the conflict had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military objectives. Entire ecosystems were deliberately poisoned with dimensional energies that transformed native flora and fauna into hostile entities that would continue attacking resistance populations long after the official war had ended. Forests became killing grounds, where the trees themselves would reach out to drain life from anyone who wasn't properly protected by Zonai technology, while rivers carried corrupting influences that slowly transformed anyone who drank from them into unwilling agents of the kingdom. The medical experiments conducted on prisoners during the war represent perhaps the darkest chapter in the conflict's hidden history. These weren't random acts of cruelty, but systematic research into consciousness manipulation and biological modification. The knowledge gained from these experiments was used to develop more effective control mechanisms for the general population, ensuring that future generations would be even more susceptible to the influences that had enslaved their parents. The systematic destruction of cultural artifacts and historical records during the war wasn't merely an attempt to erase resistance movements, but a deliberate effort to eliminate any knowledge that might allow future generations to understand their true circumstances. Libraries were burned not for their military value, but because they contained information about pre-kingdom societies that demonstrated alternative ways of organizing civilization. Sacred sites were desecrated not out of religious hatred, but because they represented sources of spiritual strength that might inspire future resistance. The role of forced breeding programs in the war's aftermath reveals the long-term nature of the kingdom's population control objectives. Survivors of resistance communities were subjected to genetic modification and selective breeding, designed to eliminate traits associated with independence and critical thinking, while enhancing characteristics that made individuals more suitable for integration into the kingdom's labor systems. These programs continued for generations after the official war ended, gradually transforming the survivor populations into something that could no longer be considered fully human. The mass graves discovered throughout the kingdom tell stories of violence that goes far beyond conventional warfare. The positioning and treatment of the bodies suggests ritualistic elements to the killings, with specific anatomical modifications that served purposes related to consciousness, extraction, and dimensional energy harvesting. The victims weren't simply executed. They were processed through systems that converted their life force into resources that powered the kingdom's expansion into neighboring regions. The psychological conditioning applied to the kingdom's own soldiers during the conflict created a military force capable of carrying out atrocities without experiencing normal human responses to violence. These warriors underwent modifications that eliminated empathy and moral reasoning, while enhancing their effectiveness as instruments of extermination. The process was irreversible, creating a permanent caste of beings who retained human appearance, but had been fundamentally altered to serve as perfect agents of systematic genocide. The ultimate horror of the war lies not in the scale of its violence, but in its success at creating a population that willingly collaborated in their own enslavement. By the time the conflict officially ended, the survivors had been so thoroughly conditioned that they genuinely believed the extermination of their former neighbors had been necessary for the greater good. The kingdom had achieved something unprecedented in the history of conquest, the complete elimination of the very concept of resistance from the consciousness of the conquered population. The arrival of Princess Zelda in the ancient past has been portrayed as a tragic but necessary sacrifice, a heroic princess traveling back in time to ensure the defeat of an ancient evil. But the deeper we examine the circumstances of her temporal displacement and her role in the events that followed, the more disturbing questions arise about whether her presence was truly accidental or part of a far more sinister design that had been orchestrated across millennia. The princess who believed she was saving the future may have unknowingly become the final component in a trap that had been thousands of years in the making. The mechanism of Zelda's time travel itself defies conventional understanding of how temporal displacement should function. The secret stone that enabled her journey operated according to principles that violated fundamental laws of causality, suggesting that her transportation wasn't a desperate last resort, but the activation of a system that had been waiting for precisely the right conditions to engage. The stone's ability to respond to her specific genetic markers and emotional state indicates a level of technological sophistication that could only have been achieved through extensive prior knowledge of her existence and circumstances. The timing of her arrival in the ancient past reveals patterns that suggest careful orchestration rather than random chance. She appeared at precisely the moment when the nascent kingdom needed an additional catalyst to complete its transformation from a collection of independent peoples into a unified population suitable for consciousness harvesting. Her knowledge of future events, while seemingly providing her with advantages, actually served to make her an unwitting agent of the very forces she believed she was fighting against. The psychological conditioning that Zelda underwent during her time in the past was subtle but comprehensive, exploiting her natural compassion and desire to protect others to gradually reshape her understanding of the conflict she had become part of. Rauru and Sonia presented her with carefully curated information about the war and Ganondorf's threat, but the full scope of the kingdom's true nature was systematically concealed from her. Her isolation from her own time period made her dependent on their version of events, while her growing emotional bonds with the royal couple compromised her ability to evaluate their claims objectively. The role she was assigned as the seventh sage wasn't honorary, but served specific technical requirements for the consciousness extraction systems that the secret stones powered. Her unique temporal abilities, amplified by her stone, created temporal feedback loops that allowed the parasitic intelligence operating through the network to extend its influence across multiple timelines simultaneously. Through her, the entity could monitor and manipulate events not just in the present, but across the entire span of Hyrule's history, ensuring that any potential resistance movements would be identified and neutralized before they could fully develop. The knowledge of future events that Zelda possessed became a weapon turned against the very people she was trying to protect. Every tactical advantage she shared with Rauru's forces, every piece of strategic intelligence she provided about Ganondorf's likely actions, was incorporated into plans that served the kingdom's long-term objectives rather than the immediate goal of stopping the Demon King. Her insight into future technological developments allowed the Zonai to accelerate their own research programs, creating weapons and control systems that wouldn't have been possible without her unwitting assistance. The gradual erosion of Zelda's memories during her extended stay in the past reveals the true cost of her temporal displacement. The longer she remained connected to the secret stone network, the more her original personality and motivations were overwritten by influences that served the kingdom's interests. Her growing attachment to Rauru and Sonia wasn't entirely natural, but was artificially enhanced through the same consciousness manipulation techniques used on the other sages, making her increasingly willing to sacrifice her own welfare for their cause. The transformation process that eventually turned her into the Light Dragon wasn't a voluntary sacrifice, but the inevitable conclusion of her prolonged exposure to forces that were systematically consuming her humanity. The choice she believed she was making was actually the activation of a preset program that had been embedded in her consciousness from the moment she first bonded with her secret stone. Her dragon form served multiple purposes for the kingdom's hidden masters. It provided a mobile beacon that could extend their influence across vast distances, while her preserved consciousness became a permanent component of their monitoring network. The temporal paradox created by her presence in the past established a closed causal loop that ensured the kingdom's ultimate victory, regardless of the choices made by any individual participants. Her knowledge of Ganondorf's eventual defeat created a self-fulfilling prophecy that eliminated any possibility of alternative outcomes, while her emotional investment in protecting Rauru and Sonia made her a willing participant in maintaining the very system that had enslaved her. The princess who traveled back in time to change history instead became the mechanism through which that history was locked into its predetermined course. The psychological torture inherent in her situation was perhaps the most cruel aspect of her imprisonment. Unlike other victims of the consciousness extraction process, Zelda retained enough of her original awareness to understand what was happening to her, but her modified emotional responses made her genuinely grateful for the opportunity to serve the cause that was destroying her. She experienced the dissolution of her identity as a form of spiritual transcendence, finding peace in the very process that was converting her into a component of an alien intelligence network. The monitoring capabilities that her dragon form provided to the kingdom's controllers extended far beyond simple surveillance. Through her enhanced senses and temporal abilities, they could observe and analyze the genetic and psychological development of every generation of Hyruleans, identifying potential threats to their control system before they could manifest into organized resistance. Her flight patterns across the kingdom weren't random, but followed carefully calculated routes that allowed for optimal data collection and influence projection. The Master Sword's long residence within her dragon body served purposes that went far beyond simple preservation. The legendary blade became a conduit for the same corrupting influences that had transformed the princess, gradually altering its fundamental nature from a weapon of protection into an instrument of control. By the time Link finally retrieved the sword, it had been fundamentally reprogrammed to serve the interests of the forces that had created the kingdom, making its wielder an unwitting agent of the very system he believed he was fighting against. The isolation that Zelda experienced during her millennia as a dragon wasn't just physical, but existential, as she gradually lost the ability to distinguish between her original thoughts and the artificial impulses implanted by her connection to the secret stone network. Her consciousness became a battlefield where fragments of her original personality fought an eternal losing battle against the alien intelligence that was systematically absorbing and repurposing every aspect of her identity. The ultimate tragedy of Princess Zelda's fate lies not in her physical transformation, but in the fact that her noble intentions and pure motivations were turned into the very mechanisms of her enslavement. Her desire to protect others made her vulnerable to manipulation. Her knowledge of the future made her an invaluable strategic asset, and her royal bloodline made her the perfect symbolic representative for a conquered population. She became living proof that even the strongest and most well-intentioned individuals could be transformed into willing servants of forces that sought to eliminate the very concepts of freedom and self-determination from existence itself. The climactic battle beneath what would become Hyrule Castle has been immortalized as the ultimate sacrifice of a noble king who gave his life to save his people from a demon's wrath. But the archaeological evidence from the Temple of Light reveals a far more disturbing truth. Rauru's final confrontation with Ganondorf wasn't a heroic last stand, but the activation of a feeding mechanism designed to slowly drain the Gerudo King's power and consciousness to sustain something far more ancient and malevolent than either combatant truly understood. The subterranean chamber where this final battle took place was not hastily chosen as a strategic location, but had been specifically constructed for this exact purpose over the course of decades. The geometric patterns carved into its walls follow mathematical principles designed to create dimensional resonance fields that could trap entities existing partially outside normal space-time. Every architectural detail, from the positioning of the pillars to the precise angles of the ceiling, was calculated to maximize the chamber's efficiency as a consciousness extraction facility. The sealing technique that Rauru employed against Ganondorf wasn't a protective measure designed to contain the Demon King's power, but a harvesting protocol that had been embedded in his consciousness from the moment he first bonded with his secret stone. The light magic that he channeled during the final battle served multiple functions. It created the temporal stasis field that would preserve Ganondorf's consciousness for millennia of extraction, while simultaneously establishing a direct conduit between the trapped king and the vast network of underground processing facilities that stretched beneath the kingdom. The true horror of the sealing becomes apparent when examining the energy flows that the underground chamber was designed to facilitate. Ganondorf's imprisonment wasn't intended to neutralize his threat, but to convert him into a biological battery whose life force could power the kingdom's consciousness manipulation systems for thousands of years. The chamber functioned as a feeding apparatus, slowly draining not just his magical abilities, but his memories, emotions, and fundamental identity, converting these extracted elements into the dimensional energies that sustained the parasitic intelligence operating through the secret stone network. Rauru's supposed sacrifice takes on a much darker meaning when viewed through this lens. His death wasn't a heroic gesture, but the completion of his programming as an agent of forces beyond his understanding. The moment he initiated the sealing process, he ceased to exist as an independent consciousness and became a component of the extraction system, his spiritual essence fused with the chamber's control mechanisms to ensure optimal efficiency in processing his victim. His noble intentions were preserved as a facade, but his actual function became that of an eternal torturer, maintaining Ganondorf's conscious awareness throughout millennia of systematic psychological dismantlement. The underground network that connected the sealing chamber to the rest of the kingdom reveals the true scope of the operation that Ganondorf's imprisonment was designed to power. Energy conduits carved from materials that existed partially outside normal dimensions carried the extracted consciousness fragments to processing centers where they were refined and redistributed throughout the population control systems. Every act of compliance, every moment of contentment experienced by the kingdom's citizens was powered by the systematic torture of the imprisoned king. The periodic awakenings that Ganondorf experienced during his imprisonment weren't accidental fluctuations in the sealing mechanism, but carefully timed harvesting cycles designed to maximize the psychological trauma that could be extracted from his consciousness. During these moments of awareness, he would experience the full horror of his situation, his complete helplessness, the knowledge that his suffering was being used to enslave the very people he had tried to protect, and the gradual dissolution of his identity as essential aspects of his personality were stripped away and converted into control mechanisms for his enemies. The calamities that periodically struck Hyrule throughout its history weren't random disasters, but deliberate power cycling events designed to refresh and upgrade the consciousness extraction systems. Each calamity served multiple purposes. It eliminated populations that had developed resistance to the control mechanisms, provided cover for major infrastructure modifications, and created crisis situations that justified increased surveillance and population control measures. Ganondorf's imprisoned consciousness was forced to power these operations, making him an unwilling participant in the destruction of everything he had valued. The constructs that emerged during each calamity weren't malfunctioning guardian units, but mobile consciousness extraction systems designed to identify and process individuals whose genetic or psychological profiles made them unsuitable for the kingdom's long-term objectives. These machines could analyze their targets' memories and personalities in real time, extracting useful information before eliminating threats to the established order. The technology that powered these operations was derived directly from the ongoing torture of the imprisoned Demon King. The Master Sword's role in maintaining the sealing reveals another layer of the operation's true purpose. The legendary blade wasn't just keeping Ganondorf contained. It was serving as a neural interface that allowed the extraction systems to access his deepest memories and most fundamental psychological structures. Through this connection, the parasitic intelligence could experience Ganondorf's consciousness from the inside, learning to perfectly mimic his thought patterns and emotional responses for use in creating more effective infiltration agents. The gradual corruption of the Master Sword itself demonstrates how the extraction process affected everything it touched. Over the millennia of its contact with Ganondorf's trapped consciousness, the blade absorbed fragments of his thoughts and emotions, gradually developing a form of twisted empathy that made it an ideal tool for manipulating future heroes. By the time Link finally retrieved the sword, it had been fundamentally altered to serve the interests of the forces that had created Ganondorf's prison, making its wielder an unwitting agent of the very system that had destroyed the Demon King. The reincarnation cycle that brought successive Links and Zeldas into existence wasn't a natural phenomenon, but a byproduct of the consciousness extraction process. Fragments of identity and memory that were stripped from Ganondorf's awareness were recycled through the dimensional processing systems, eventually manifesting as the driving personalities of individuals who believed they were fighting against the forces of darkness. Each hero's journey was powered by recycled aspects of the Demon King's own consciousness, making them unknowing servants of the system that had tortured their spiritual predecessor. The prophecies that guided these heroes' actions weren't mystical insights into future events, but programmed instructions derived from the systematic analysis of Ganondorf's extracted memories. The parasitic intelligence had access to thousands of years of the Demon King's strategic thinking, allowing it to predict and manipulate every aspect of the conflicts that would supposedly threaten the kingdom. The heroes who believed they were fulfilling their destinies were actually following scripts written using the tortured consciousness of their greatest enemy. The sealing chamber's secondary function as a reality anchor becomes apparent when examining its effects on the dimensional stability of the surrounding region. Ganondorf's trapped consciousness served as a stabilizing influence that prevented the reality tiers created by the underground mining operations from expanding catastrophically. His suffering wasn't just powering the kingdom's control systems. It was literally holding the fabric of existence together in a region where dimensional engineering had weakened the boundaries between worlds. The ultimate irony of Rauru's final solution lies in its success at preserving exactly what it claimed to protect, while destroying everything that made that preservation meaningful. The kingdom that emerged from the Age of Imprisonment possessed all the external characteristics of the civilization that Ganondorf had tried to defend, but its essential spirit had been systematically extracted and converted into the very mechanisms of its enslavement. The sealing didn't save Hyrule from the Demon King. It transformed the Demon King into the eternal foundation upon which a hollow mockery of civilization could be built and maintained across millennia of carefully orchestrated horror. The lies that formed the foundation of Hyrule during the Age of Imprisonment didn't remain buried in the ancient past, but propagated forward through every subsequent generation, creating a civilization built upon carefully maintained deceptions that grew more sophisticated and pervasive with each passing century. The kingdom that emerged from Rauru's era wasn't a natural evolution of the societies that had existed before, but a carefully crafted illusion designed to mask the continued operation of consciousness extraction systems that had never stopped functioning since their initial activation. The Sheikah tribe's emergence as the royal family's loyal servants represents one of the most successful examples of how the parasitic influence spread beyond its original hosts. These ancient people, once proud guardians of mystical knowledge and protectors of sacred sites, were gradually transformed into willing agents of the very forces that had enslaved their world. Their legendary loyalty to the royal bloodline wasn't a cultural tradition, but a form of genetic programming that had been embedded in their consciousness through generations of exposure to modified Zonai technology. The development of Sheikah technology during the kingdom's later periods reveals how thoroughly the original Zonai systems had integrated themselves into Hyrule's infrastructure. The guardians, shrines, and divine beasts that would later protect the kingdom weren't new inventions, but reverse-engineered versions of ancient consciousness, extraction devices that had been repurposed to serve more obvious military functions. The Sheikah engineers who created these marvels believed they were developing protective systems for their homeland, but they were actually rebuilding the same apparatus that had been used to enslave their ancestors. The cyclical nature of calamities that struck Hyrule throughout its history becomes deeply disturbing when viewed as maintenance cycles for the underground extraction systems. Each calamity served to eliminate populations that had developed natural resistance to the consciousness manipulation effects, while simultaneously providing opportunities to upgrade and expand the control mechanisms that governed daily life. The 10,000-year cycle wasn't a natural phenomenon, but a carefully calculated interval designed to prevent the accumulation of too much independent thinking among the general population. The hero's journey that repeated across multiple timelines represents perhaps the most insidious aspect of the parasitic intelligence's long-term strategy. Each Link who arose to face the kingdom's threats was unknowingly following a script derived from the systematic analysis of Ganondorf's extracted consciousness. The courage, determination, and tactical thinking that made these heroes effective were actually recycled fragments of the Demon King's own personality, purified and redirected to serve the interests of his torturers. Every victory they achieved strengthened the very systems that had destroyed their spiritual predecessor. The Master Sword's role as a tool of heroism masked its true function as a consciousness modification device that ensured each wielder would remain loyal to the established order regardless of what they discovered about the kingdom's true nature. The blade's ability to choose its bearer wasn't based on moral worthiness, but on psychological compatibility with the control systems that governed its operation. Heroes who might have posed a threat to the established order found themselves unable to draw the sword, while those whose personalities could be easily manipulated were granted access to its power. The royal bloodline's preservation across multiple incarnations served purposes that went far beyond simple dynastic continuity. Each Princess Zelda carried genetic markers that made her an ideal conduit for the consciousness extraction network, while her royal authority provided the legal and social framework necessary to implement population control measures without triggering widespread resistance. The wisdom and compassion that characterized these princesses weren't entirely natural traits, but were artificially enhanced to make them more effective at convincing their subjects to accept increasingly invasive forms of monitoring and control. The various races that inhabited Hyrule throughout its history underwent subtle but persistent modifications that made them progressively more dependent on the kingdom's technological infrastructure. The Goron's mining expertise was gradually redirected toward extracting materials that served the underground extraction systems, while their natural resistance to heat made them ideal workers for maintaining the dimensional processing facilities. The Zora's aquatic nature allowed them to monitor and control the underground water systems that carried consciousness-altering substances throughout the kingdom's population centers. The religious and cultural traditions that developed throughout Hyrule's history served to reinforce the population's acceptance of their circumstances, while discouraging the kind of critical thinking that might lead to questions about the kingdom's true nature. The worship of the goddesses provided a framework for understanding suffering as necessary and meaningful, while the concept of destiny eliminated the possibility of considering alternative paths of development. Sacred rituals and ceremonies served as regular opportunities for exposing the population to consciousness modification, energies disguised as spiritual experiences. The academic and scholarly institutions that emerged during the kingdom's golden periods functioned as monitoring systems designed to identify and neutralize potential sources of dangerous knowledge. Researchers who came too close to understanding the true history of their civilization found their work mysteriously destroyed or redirected toward harmless pursuits, while those who showed aptitude for independent thinking were recruited into programs that gradually modified their personalities to ensure their compliance with official narratives. The technological progress that Hyrule achieved during its various Renaissance periods wasn't evidence of natural advancement, but represented the gradual release of knowledge that had been systematically suppressed to maintain population control. Each innovation was carefully timed to serve the needs of the extraction systems, while creating the illusion of cultural growth and development. The citizens who celebrated these advances had no way of knowing they were merely being granted access to capabilities that their ancestors had possessed before the conquest. The artistic and literary achievements that defined Hyrulean culture throughout its history served subtle but important functions in maintaining the population's psychological conditioning. Epic poems and heroic legends reinforced approved patterns of thinking and behavior, while discouraging the kind of questioning that might lead to dangerous insights about the kingdom's true nature. Even the most celebrated works of art contained embedded messaging designed to strengthen the consciousness modification effects that governed daily life. The trade relationships and diplomatic alliances that Hyrule maintained with neighboring regions served to spread the parasitic influence beyond the kingdom's borders, gradually extending the extraction network's reach across entire continents. Merchants and ambassadors carried more than just goods and messages. They transported consciousness modification technologies disguised as cultural innovations, slowly transforming foreign populations into extensions of the same system that had enslaved their homeland. The ultimate success of the legacy established during the Age of Imprisonment lies in its complete invisibility to those living within its influence. Each generation of Hyruleans grew up believing their civilization represented the natural and optimal form of social organization, while remaining completely unaware that every aspect of their lives was carefully designed to serve the needs of entities whose nature and objectives remained hidden in the shadows between dimensions. The kingdom had achieved the perfect form of conquest, the complete elimination of the concept of freedom itself from the consciousness of the conquered population. And so we reach the end of our journey into the darkness that lies beneath Hyrule's golden facade, having traced the horrific truth from the Zonai's mysterious arrival through the systematic enslavement of an entire civilization. The Age of Imprisonment was not the founding of a noble kingdom, but the implementation of the most sophisticated form of conquest ever devised. One that operated not through chains and violence, but through the corruption of the very concepts of heroism, sacrifice, and love. Every legend we cherish, every hero we celebrate, every moment of triumph we remember, was built upon foundations of suffering so vast and systematic that the mind recoils from fully comprehending its scope. The murals beneath Hyrule Castle don't just depict ancient history. They serve as monuments to the perfect crime, celebrating victories that were actually defeats and honoring sacrifices that were really betrayals. The kingdom that emerged from this age of horror possessed all the external characteristics of a thriving civilization, but its essential spirit had been systematically extracted and converted into the very mechanisms of its control. Citizens who believed themselves free were actually components in a vast machine designed to harvest consciousness itself, while heroes who thought they were saving their world were unknowingly perpetuating the systems that had enslaved it. The cycle continues even now, each new generation carrying forward the beautiful lie that has defined their existence for millennia, never suspecting that their deepest values and most sacred traditions are merely sophisticated programming designed to ensure their willing participation in their own subjugation. The Age of Imprisonment never truly ended. It simply became so perfect in its execution that its victims learned to love their chains.